The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Navy SEAL Team 7 moved through the valley in tactical formation. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and distant gunpowder. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his rifle and scanned the horizon through his scope. Behind him, the team moved like ghosts, their boots barely making a sound on the rough ground. "Alpha Base, this is Shadow 7, Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "We're approaching the target location. No visual contact with hostiles yet." The crackling voice of their commanding officer came through clearly. "Copy that, Shadow 7. Remember, this is a rescue mission. Intelligence suggests 3 American contractors are being held in the compound. Get in, get them out, minimal engagement." Rodriguez acknowledged and signaled to his team. 6 elite Navy SEALs spread out in perfect synchronization, each man knowing his role without needing words. They had trained for months for missions like this, but something about today felt different. The intelligence had been sparse, and the location seemed too quiet for a hostile compound. As they crested a small hill, the target came into view. A modest stone building surrounded by a low wall, seemingly abandoned except for a thin wisp of smoke rising from what looked like a chimney. Rodriguez frowned. This wasn't the heavily fortified position they had expected. "Something's not right," muttered Petty Officer Jake Thompson, the team's communications specialist. He was known for his sharp instincts, and Rodriguez had learned to trust them. "Stay alert," Rodriguez replied, his voice barely audible. "We proceed as planned." The team moved closer, using the natural cover of rocks and sparse vegetation. As they approached the compound's perimeter, Rodriguez held up his fist, bringing the entire team to an immediate halt. His trained ears had picked up something that didn't belong in this desolate landscape. Crying. Not the harsh sounds of combat or the shouts of enemy fighters, but the soft, heartbreaking sound of someone in pain. Someone afraid. Rodriguez looked back at his team. Each man's face reflected the same confusion he felt. This was supposed to be a hostile compound, but the sounds coming from inside suggested something entirely different. Change of approach, Rodriguez decided. Thompson, Miller cover the rear. Rest of us move to the front entrance. Something's not adding up here. Petty Officer David Miller, their medic, adjusted his medical pack and nodded. Miller was a contradiction that worked perfectly in their line of work. He could end a life with deadly precision, but he had also saved more lives than anyone could count. His gentle hands could perform surgery in a foxhole under enemy fire, and his calm voice had talked more than one wounded soldier back from the edge of death. As they reached the compound's main entrance, Rodriguez noticed the wooden door was slightly ajar. No guards, no defensive positions, no signs of the organized resistance they had been briefed to expect. Instead, the crying continued, joined now by what sounded like hushed voices speaking in English. "This is all wrong," Thompson said through the radio. "Intel said this place was crawling with hostiles." Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Instead of following standard breach protocol, he decided to approach carefully and assess the situation. He pushed the door open slowly, his weapon ready but not aggressively positioned. What they found inside shattered every preconception they had about their mission. The interior of the building had been converted into a makeshift medical facility. Rough wooden tables served as operating surfaces, and medical supplies were scattered throughout the room. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air. But it wasn't the improvised hospital that stopped the SEALs in their tracks. It was the people inside. 3 women, clearly American from their features and clothing, were tending to what appeared to be local villagers. Children with bandaged wounds, elderly men with makeshift splints, women holding infants that looked malnourished and sick. The crying they had heard was coming from a young boy, maybe 8 years old, whose leg was clearly broken. The 3 American women looked up as the SEALs entered, and their faces showed not the relief of rescued hostages, but confusion and something that looked like protective defiance. "Who are you?" demanded the eldest of the 3 women, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands were stained with blood, and she positioned herself protectively in front of the wounded boy. Rodriguez lowered his weapon slightly, his mind racing to process this unexpected situation. "Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs. We're here to rescue you. Our intelligence indicated you were being held hostage." The woman's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. "Hostage? We're not hostages. We're doctors. We're here voluntarily, providing medical care to people who have nowhere else to turn." The youngest of the three women, who couldn't have been more than 25, stepped forward. She had short brown hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious shock of seeing armed soldiers in her makeshift clinic. "We're part of Doctors Without Borders. We've been working in this region for 6 months." Miller, the team medic, found himself staring at the scene with a mixture of professional admiration and personal confusion. The medical setup was impressive considering the circumstances. These women had created a functioning clinic in what was essentially a war zone, and the evidence of their work was everywhere. Clean bandages, properly administered medications, careful documentation of treatments. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, trying to maintain his professional composure while his mind raced through the implications of what they were seeing. "Our intelligence clearly indicated that 3 American contractors were being held against their will in this location. We have orders to extract you immediately." The eldest doctor, who had introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Meadows, shook her head firmly. "There's been a terrible mistake. We chose to be here. These people need our help. We can't just leave them." Rodriguez activated his radio to contact Alpha Base, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from outside. The distinctive rumble of military trucks was unmistakable, and it was getting closer fast. "Thompson, Miller, what's your status?" Rodriguez called into his radio. Thompson's voice came back tense. "We've got company, Sarge. 3 trucks, heavily armed. They're not flying friendly colors." The situation had just become infinitely more complicated. The SEALs had been sent to rescue 3 women who didn't want to be rescued, and now they were about to face real hostiles while protecting civilians in an improvised medical facility. Dr. Meadows must have recognized the change in the soldier's demeanor because her voice took on a new urgency. "There's a back entrance through the storage room," she said quickly. "But we can't leave these patients. Some of them will die without continued care." The youngest doctor, who had identified herself as Sarah Chun, was already moving toward the wounded boy with the broken leg. "If there's going to be fighting, we need to get the children to safety first." Rodriguez found himself in an impossible situation. His orders were clear: extract the Americans and return to base. But his training and his conscience wouldn't allow him to abandon wounded civilians to hostile forces. "Miller," he called his medic. "Assessment of the wounded. Can any of them be moved safely?" Miller moved quickly through the room, his trained eye evaluating each patient. "The boy with the broken leg. Maybe if we can stabilize the fracture. The elderly man in the corner has what looks like a serious abdominal wound. Moving him could kill him. The woman with the head bandage shouldn't be moved at all." The sound of the approaching trucks was getting louder, and Rodriguez could hear shouting in what sounded like Pashto. Time was running out. "Dr. Meadows," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the authority of command. "I understand your commitment to these people, but if those trucks contain who I think they do, staying here isn't just dangerous for you. It's dangerous for your patients, too." Dr. Meadows looked around the room at the wounded villagers, her face reflecting the impossible choice she was being asked to make. "These people trusted us," she said quietly. "We promised we wouldn't abandon them." Sarah Chun had finished stabilizing the boy's leg as much as possible with the available supplies. She looked up at Rodriguez with those intelligent green eyes. "How many men do you have?" "6 total, ma'am." She nodded, seeming to calculate something in her head. "The building has thick stone walls. If your men can hold off whatever's coming long enough for us to stabilize the most critical patients, Maybe we can figure out a way to evacuate everyone." Rodriguez stared at her for a moment, surprised by her tactical thinking. Most civilians would have been demanding immediate evacuation, but this young doctor was thinking like a soldier, considering all the variables and looking for a solution that would save everyone. The third doctor, Dr. Lisa Martinez, spoke up for the first time. "There's a village about 2 kilometers north of here. They have a larger clinic. If we could get the patients there." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the trucks pulling up outside the compound. Voices shouted in multiple languages, and Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of weapons being readied. "Thompson, how many hostiles?" Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Looks like 12 to 15 armed men, Sarge. They're surrounding the building. I count at least 3 RPGs and multiple assault rifles." Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. "All units, establish defensive positions. We're protecting the civilians until we can find a way to evacuate everyone." Dr. Meadows looked at him with surprise. "You're staying? But your orders?" Rodriguez checked his weapon and moved toward a window that offered a good defensive position. "Ma'am, sometimes the mission changes. Miller, help the doctors prepare the patients for possible movement. Everyone else, defensive positions." As the SEALs took up positions around the improvised clinic, Rodriguez found himself watching Sarah Chun as she continued working on the wounded boy. Her hands never shook. Her voice remained calm as she spoke to the frightened child in broken Pashto, and her focus never wavered despite the clear sounds of armed men surrounding the building. There was something about her that reminded him of the best soldiers he had served with. A calmness under pressure, a refusal to abandon those who depended on her, and a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training or experience. The first shots fired came without warning, shattering the tense quiet that had settled over the compound. The hostile forces had apparently decided that negotiation was an option. Bullets struck the stone walls with sharp cracks, sending chips of rock flying through the air. "Stay down," Rodriguez yelled to the civilians as he returned fire through the window. But even as chaos erupted around them, Sarah Chun continued working on her patient, shielding the boy's body with her own while she finished bandaging his leg. Dr. Meadows and Dr. Martinez followed her example, continuing to tend to their patients while bullets flew overhead. Rodriguez had seen courage before. He had served with some of the bravest men and women in the world. But watching these 3 doctors risk their own lives to protect and treat wounded villagers in the middle of a firefight was something that transcended anything he had witnessed in his military career. "Miller," Rodriguez called to his medic. "How long do you need?" Miller was helping Dr. Martinez move the elderly man with the abdominal wound to a more protected area. "At least 15 minutes to get everyone stable enough to move, Sarge." 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions outside, and the volume of incoming fire was increasing. His team was skilled, but they were outnumbered and in a defensive position with limited ammunition. "Thompson, can you get eyes on any kind of evacuation route?" Rodriguez called into his radio. "Negative on the back entrance, Sarge. They've got it covered. But there's a dry creek bed about 50 meters to the east that might provide concealment if we can reach it." Rodriguez assessed their options. 50 meters of open ground under fire, carrying wounded civilians, being pursued by superior numbers. It wasn't exactly a promising scenario, but as he watched Sarah Chun gently lift the wounded boy and whisper something in his ear that made him stop crying, Rodriguez knew that retreat wasn't really an option. These people had put their lives on the line for strangers, for people who couldn't fight back, for the simple reason that it was the right thing to do. If Navy SEALs couldn't protect people like that, what was the point of all their training and equipment? "All units," Rodriguez said into his radio, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had found his purpose. "We hold this position. We protect these people, whatever it takes." The firefight continued to intensify, but inside the improvised clinic, 3 American doctors continued their work, treating wounded villagers while Navy SEALs held the line around them. And In that moment, the lines between military and civilian, between American and Afghan, between trained soldier and voluntary healer, began to blur into something larger than any of them had expected. The real test of their courage was just beginning. The firefight raged for 23 minutes before the first SEAL was hit. Petty Officer Jake Thompson took a round in the shoulder while providing covering fire from the rear window. The bullet punched through his tactical vest at an angle where the armor plates didn't overlap, and he went down hard behind an overturned table. "Thompson's hit," Miller called out, but before he could move to help his teammate, Sarah Chun was already there. Rodriguez watched in amazement as the young doctor crawled across the floor, staying low under the incoming fire, and reached Thompson's position. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for the shooting to stop. She simply saw someone who needed help and responded. "Where are you hit?" she asked Thompson, her voice calm despite the bullets whistling overhead. Thompson grimaced, pressing his hand against his shoulder. "Shoulder. Went clean through, I think." Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away his tactical vest and shirt to expose the wound. Her assessment was quick, but thorough. "You're right, it's a through. Missed the major arteries, but you're losing blood fast." As she worked to control the bleeding, Thompson stared at her with growing respect. "You've done this before," he said. "Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria," she replied without looking up from her work. "This isn't my first firefight." Rodriguez felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just a young doctor who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was someone who had deliberately put herself in harm's way, repeatedly, to help people others had given up on. "Miller," Rodriguez called to his medic. "Status report on the civilians." Miller was helping Dr. Meadows stabilize the elderly man with the abdominal wound. "The boy with the broken leg is stable. Dr. Martinez has the head injury patient ready to move. But the old man," Miller shook his head. "He needs surgery, real surgery, or he's not going to make it." The sound of an RPG exploding against the exterior wall punctuated his words, sending a shower of stone fragments across the room. The children started crying again, and Dr. Meadows immediately moved to comfort them while still maintaining pressure on her patient's wounds. Rodriguez activated his radio to contact Alpha Base. "Alpha Base, this is Shadow 7. We have a complex situation here. The supposed hostages are medical personnel who refuse to abandon their patients. We're taking fire from unknown hostiles, and we have wounded civilians who can't be moved safely." The response was immediate and unwelcome. "Shadow 7, your orders are to extract the American personnel and return to base immediately. Do not engage in extended combat operations." Rodriguez looked around the room at the wounded villagers, at his own injured teammate being treated by a doctor who should have been evacuated 20 minutes ago, at 3 American women who had voluntarily put themselves in one of the most dangerous places on Earth to help strangers. "Alpha Base," Rodriguez said carefully, "the situation has changed. These are not hostages. They are medical personnel providing humanitarian aid to local civilians. We have wounded on both sides who cannot be safely moved at this time." The radio silence that followed was telling. Rodriguez knew his commanding officer was weighing the political implications of American soldiers dying to protect civilian doctors who weren't supposed to be there in the first place. Sarah finished bandaging Thompson's shoulder and helped him sit up against the wall. "You'll live," she told him, "but you're done fighting for today. That arm needs to stay immobilized." Thompson nodded, then looked at her with curiosity. "Doc, can I ask you something? Why are you really here? I mean, you could be practicing medicine anywhere in the world, making good money, staying safe. Why this?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, checking her bandage work. "You see that little girl over there?" She pointed to a child who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, lying on a makeshift bed with her leg in a splint. 3 weeks ago, she stepped on an unexploded piece of ordnance. Lost most of her foot. There's no hospital within 200 miles that would treat her because her family can't pay. Thompson followed her gaze to the little girl, who was clutching a worn stuffed animal and watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "Her name is Amara. Sarah continued. She wants to be a teacher when she grows up. 3 weeks ago, she thought she'd never walk again. Today, she took her first steps with a prosthetic foot Dr. Meadows helped me fit for her. Thompson was quiet for a moment. That's why you won't leave. That's why I can't leave, Sarah corrected. These people don't have anyone else. The local government can't help them. International aid organizations won't come here because it's too dangerous. We're the only thing standing between them, and she gestured toward the sounds of gunfire outside. Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation while maintaining his defensive position. Something about Sarah's words triggered a memory from his own childhood. Growing up in East LA, he had seen what happened to communities when the people who were supposed to help them gave up and walked away. Alpha Base, this is Shadow 7, Rodriguez said into his radio, making a decision that he knew might end his military career. We are establishing a defensive perimeter and will hold this position until the civilian medical personnel can safely evacuate their patients. The response was immediate and harsh. Shadow 7, you are ordered to extract the American personnel immediately and return to base. This is a direct order. Rodriguez looked around the room one more time. Dr. Meadows was singing softly to the wounded children, her voice somehow managing to be heard over the gunfire. Dr. Martinez was carefully monitoring the head injury patient, adjusting bandages and checking pupil responses with a pen light. Sarah was already moving to help Miller with another wounded villager who had been brought in during the firefight. Alpha Base, Rodriguez said quietly into his radio. I understand the order, but I cannot comply at this time. Shadow 7 out. He switched off his radio and looked at his team. Each of his men was watching him, waiting for his lead. They all understood what he had just done. Disobeying a direct order in a combat situation was a career-ending move at best. Anyone who wants to follow orders and head back to base, I'll cover your retreat, Rodriguez announced to his team. No judgment, no hard feelings. You all have families and careers to think about. Not one of his men moved toward the door. Guess we're all idiots, Thompson said from his position against the wall, managing a weak smile despite his wound. Miller looked up from his patient and grinned. Best kind of idiots to serve with. The firefight outside seemed to be intensifying with more frequent automatic weapons fire and the occasional explosion. Rodriguez moved from window to window, assessing their defensive situation. The hostile forces had them surrounded, but the stone building was solid, and his team had good defensive positions. How long can we hold? Dr. Meadows asked, approaching his position while staying low. Rodriguez considered the question honestly. Depends on their numbers and how much ammunition they're willing to spend. We've got enough firepower to keep them at distance for a while, but if they decide to make a coordinated assault, Dr. Meadows nodded, understanding the implications. What about evacuation? Is there any way to get the patients out? Before Rodriguez could answer, Sarah appeared beside them. There might be, she said. Dr. Meadows, remember what the village elder told us about the old supply tunnels? Dr. Meadows's eyes widened. You think they're still passable? What tunnels? Rodriguez asked. Sarah explained quickly. During the Soviet occupation, the villagers dug a series of tunnels connecting buildings in the area. They used them to move supplies and people without being seen. One of the entrances is supposed to be in the storage room of this building. Rodriguez felt a spark of hope. Where does it lead? If the elder was right, it comes out near the old mosque about half a kilometer from here. From there, we could reach the village with a larger clinic. Rodriguez called Miller over and explained the situation. Miller immediately grasped the tactical possibilities. If we could move the patients through the tunnel, we could establish a new defensive position at the mosque while the doctors continue treatment. There's one problem, Sarah said. We have to move the patients one at a time, and someone would need to stay here to provide cover during the evacuation. The hostiles outside would notice if the gunfire stopped. Rodriguez understood the implication. Someone would have to hold the building while the civilians escaped, knowing that they might not be able to follow. I'll stay, Rodriguez said immediately. We'll stay, Miller corrected. This is a team decision. Dr. Meadows looked at both men with a mixture of gratitude and concern. There has to be another way. Sarah was already thinking tactically, her mind working through the logistics. What if we create a diversion? Draw some of their forces away from the building while we begin the evacuation. What kind of diversion? Rodriguez asked. Thompson, despite his injury, managed to contribute from his position against the wall. Sarge, remember the emergency beacon in your pack? If we activate it and place it somewhere away from the building, it might draw their attention. They'd think we were trying to signal for extraction. It was a risky plan, but Rodriguez could see the logic. It might work, but someone would have to get outside to plant the beacon, and that's essentially a suicide mission. Not necessarily, Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made everyone look at her closely. I know this area better than any of you. I've been working in villages all through these mountains for 6 months. I know paths that don't show up on any map. Rodriguez shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. You're a civilian, and you're not trained for this kind of operation. Sarah's green eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. Staff Sergeant, with all due respect, I've been moving through hostile territory for half a year. I've had to avoid Taliban patrols, local militias, and government forces who don't want foreigners in their territory. I'm not some helpless civilian who just happened to wander into a war zone. Rodriguez studied her face, seeing something he had missed before. There was a hardness around her eyes, a watchfulness in the way she held herself that spoke of someone who had faced real danger and survived it. What's your background, Dr. Chun? Rodriguez asked quietly. 4 years in Afghanistan with Doctors Without Borders. 2 years in Iraq. 18 months in Syria. I've been shot at, kidnapped twice, and nearly killed by an IED outside Aleppo. I'm still here because I learned how to survive in places like this. The room fell silent except for the continued sounds of gunfire outside. Rodriguez realized he had been thinking about Sarah Chun all wrong. She wasn't a civilian who needed to be protected. She was a veteran of a different kind of war, someone who had chosen to fight battles with medical instruments instead of weapons, but who had faced the same dangers and made the same sacrifices as any soldier. Even if you could place the beacon without being detected, Rodriguez said, you'd never make it back here before they realized what happened. I wouldn't come back here, Sarah replied. I'd head directly to the mosque and help prepare for the patients. Once you get them moving through the tunnel, I could provide medical support on the other end. Dr. Meadows was shaking her head. Sarah, this is too dangerous. If something happens to you, if we don't try something, people are going to die, Sarah said firmly. The old man with the abdominal wound won't survive much longer without proper surgery. The head injury patient needs a CT scan that we can't provide here. And those children are terrified. Every minute we stay here, their chances of survival get worse. Rodriguez found himself in the impossible position of having to decide whether to allow a civilian doctor to risk her life on a military operation. Everything in his training told him it was wrong. But everything in his experience told him that Sarah Chun was probably their best hope of getting everyone out alive. What about the tunnel? Rodriguez asked. Are you certain it's still passable? Dr. Martinez, who had been listening to the conversation while monitoring her patients, spoke up. I explored part of it 2 weeks ago when we were looking for storage space. The entrance is definitely there, and the first 50 meters or so are clear. I didn't go farther because I didn't have proper lighting, but it seemed structurally sound. Rodriguez made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. Dr. Chun, if you're going to do this, we do it right. Miller, give her your emergency radio and GPS unit. Dr. Chun, you plant the beacon, then head directly for the mosque. Radio us when you're in position. We'll start moving patients through the tunnel as soon as we know you're clear. Sarah nodded, checking the equipment Miller handed her. How long before you activate the beacon? Rodriguez checked his watch. Give me 10 minutes to brief the team and prepare the patients for movement. When that beacon goes active, things are going to get intense fast. As Sarah prepared to leave, Dr. Meadows grabbed her arm. Be careful. These people need you, but we need you too. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the firefight began, she looked like the young woman she actually was. I'll be fine. I didn't survive this long by taking unnecessary risks. Rodriguez watched her check her route one more time, then moved toward the storage room where the tunnel entrance was located. There was something about her movements, a fluidity and awareness that reminded him of his best soldiers. She wasn't just brave, she was competent in a way that most people never had the opportunity to discover about themselves. As Sarah disappeared into the storage room, Rodriguez gathered his team for a final briefing. In 10 minutes, they would either be beginning a successful evacuation or fighting for their lives in a collapsing tactical situation. But as he looked around the room at the wounded villagers who were depending on them, at his own injured teammate, at Dr. Meadows, and Dr. Martinez, who had refused to abandon their patients, Rodriguez knew they had already won the only victory that really mattered. They had chosen to stand with the people who couldn't stand for themselves. Everything else was just tactics. The tunnel was worse than Sarah had hoped, but better than she had feared. The entrance in the storage room was partially hidden behind stacks of medical supplies, and she had to move several heavy boxes to clear the way. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, and it sloped downward into darkness. Sarah attached her penlight to her shirt and squeezed through the entrance. The tunnel was carved from the rocky soil and reinforced with wooden beams that creaked ominously as she passed underneath them. Some sections had partially collapsed, forcing her to crawl on her belly through spaces that felt barely wider than her shoulders. The air was stale and thick with dust that made her want to cough, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and quietly. Above her, she could still hear the muffled sounds of gunfire, but they seemed distant and unreal in the underground darkness. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Sarah reached a section where the tunnel branched in two directions. She paused, trying to remember the village elder's description of the tunnel system. Left should lead toward the mosque, while right connected to what used to be a grain storage facility. She chose left and continued crawling, her penlight creating a small circle of visibility in the oppressive darkness. The wooden beams here were in better condition, and she could feel a slight current of air that suggested the tunnel was open somewhere ahead. Finally, after another 10 minutes of crawling, Sarah saw a hint of natural light filtering down from above. She reached a section where the tunnel ended in a vertical shaft with handholds carved into the stone walls. Above her, she could see a wooden cover that looked like it might be the entrance from the mosque side. Sarah climbed carefully, testing each handhold before putting her full weight on it. The wooden cover was heavier than expected, but she managed to push it aside enough to squeeze through into what appeared to be a storage area behind the mosque's main building. The mosque had been abandoned for months, but its stone construction was solid, and it offered multiple defensive positions with good fields of fire. Sarah activated her radio as she moved toward the main entrance. Shadow 7. This is Dr. Chun. I'm in position at the mosque. The tunnel is passable, but it's going to be slow going for the patients. How much time do I have before you activate the beacon? Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. 3 minutes, document. How does the mosque look for a defensive position? Sarah assessed quickly, drawing on months of experience evaluating potential safe houses in hostile territory. It's solid. Stone construction, multiple exit routes, good sight lines in all directions. If we can get the patients here, we can hold this position long enough to stabilize them for transport to the larger clinic. Copy that. Dr. Meadows and Dr. Martinez are preparing the patients for movement. The boy with the broken leg will go first, followed by the head injury patient. Can you handle receiving them on your end? Sarah was already setting up a basic triage area, using supplies from her medical pack. Affirmative. I'll have everything ready. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about how she had ended up in this situation. 3 years ago, she had been a resident at Johns Hopkins, on track for a comfortable career in emergency medicine. The turning point had come during a lecture about international humanitarian medicine. The speaker had shown photos from refugee camps and war zones, places where a single doctor could save dozens of lives that would otherwise be lost to violence and neglect. That night, Sarah had gone home to her comfortable apartment and try to go back to studying for her boards. But the images from the lecture kept intruding on her thoughts. Children with treatable diseases dying because no one would help them. Women giving birth without medical assistance. Elderly people suffering from conditions that could be cured with basic medications. 6 months later, she had joined Doctors Without Borders and requested assignment to their most dangerous posting. Her friends thought she was having some kind of breakdown. Her family was convinced she was trying to prove something to herself. Maybe they were right, but Sarah had discovered something in those first weeks in Afghanistan that she had never felt in the safe, sterile environment of an American hospital. Purpose. Every patient mattered in a way that was immediate and undeniable. Every successful treatment was a victory against forces that wanted to reduce human beings to statistics. Every day she worked, she was making a choice to stand between vulnerable people and the violence that threatened to consume them. The radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. Dr. Chun, beacon activation in 30 seconds. Get ready for the show. Sarah positioned herself where she could watch both the tunnel entrance and the approaches to the mosque. Through the stone walls, she could still hear the distant sounds of the firefight, but it was about to get much more intense. The emergency beacon was designed to broadcast a signal that would be picked up by any military or rescue forces in the area. When the hostiles detected it, they would assume the Americans were calling for backup and would likely concentrate their forces on the signal's location. The explosion that followed the beacon's activation was much larger than Sarah had expected. Rodriguez had apparently attached it to some kind of explosive device, creating a fireball that lit up the early evening sky. The psychological effect was immediate and dramatic. The volume of gunfire around the clinic suddenly increased, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the hostile forces redirected their attention toward the beacon's location. More importantly, she could see several groups of armed men moving away from the clinic and toward the explosion site. Her radio crackled. Dr. Chun, the diversion worked better than expected. We're starting to move the first patient now. ETA to your position is approximately 15 minutes. Copy that, Shadow 7. I'll be ready. Sarah spent the next few minutes setting up everything she would need to continue treating the patients once they arrived. The mosque had a well, which meant clean water for irrigation and cleaning wounds. The main hall had good natural light from high windows, and the stone floor could be easily cleaned and sanitized. As she worked, Sarah found herself listening to the patterns of gunfire in the distance. Her months in war zones had taught her to read the rhythm of combat. The hostile forces were definitely focusing most of their attention on the beacon site, but they hadn't completely abandoned their positions around the clinic. Rodriguez and his team were going to have to maintain their defensive positions while simultaneously moving wounded civilians through a narrow tunnel. The sound of someone moving through the tunnel reached her just as she finished setting up her makeshift treatment area. Sarah moved to the tunnel entrance and helped guide the first patient up from the underground passage. It was the little boy with a broken leg, and he was terrified. He had never seen an American woman before meeting the doctors, and now he was being passed between armed strangers in dark underground spaces. Sarah immediately knelt beside him and began speaking in her limited Pashto, trying to reassure him that he was safe. His name is Ahmad, Dr. Martinez said as she emerged from the tunnel behind the boy. He's been incredibly brave through all of this. Sarah smiled at Ahmad and continued speaking to him in Pashto while she examined his leg. The field splint Rodriguez's team had applied was holding well, but she could see swelling that indicated internal bleeding. The boy needed proper medical imaging and possibly surgery to repair damaged blood vessels. How many more patients are coming through? Sarah asked Dr. Martinez. For more, plus Dr. Meadows and hopefully all of Rodriguez's team. The elderly man with the abdominal wound is next, but Dr. Martinez's expression was grim. I don't think he's going to survive the trip through the tunnel. He's losing too much blood and the stress of being moved. Sarah understood the implication. They were about to face the horrible reality of battlefield medicine, sometimes the act of saving someone required choices that might kill them. The next patient to emerge from the tunnel confirmed Dr. Martinez's fears. The elderly man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah immediately began checking his vital signs while Dr. Martinez started in 4-line to replace some of the blood he had lost. "We need to get him to the larger clinic immediately," Sarah said. "He needs surgery within the hour, or he's not going to make it." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "The village is 2 kilometers from here, but we'd have to move him over rough terrain at night while avoiding any hostile forces that might be in the area." As if summoned by their conversation, the radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. "Dr. Chun, we've got a problem. Long-range reconnaissance shows more hostile vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like reinforcements. We need to accelerate the evacuation timeline." Sarah looked down at the elderly man, whose skin was growing pale and clammy. Even if they could get him to the village clinic immediately, his chances were slim. But if they had to wait for all the patients to come through the tunnel and then move as a group, he would certainly die. "Shadow 7, Sarah said into the radio, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'm going to take the critical patient and head for the village clinic now. Dr. Martinez will stay here to receive the remaining patients." "Negative, Dr. Chun. Too dangerous to move alone." Sarah looked around the mosque, calculating distances and routes. The village was 2 kilometers through rocky terrain, but she had made similar journeys multiple times during her months in the region. More importantly, every minute they delayed reduced the elderly man's chances of survival. "Shadow 7, I've made this trip before. I know the route, and I can move faster with 1 patient than we could with a group. Dr. Martinez needs to be here for the other patients anyway." There was a long pause before Rodriguez responded. "Dr. Chun, if you're going to do this, take one of our radios and check in every 15 minutes. At the first sign of trouble, you find cover and call for support." Sarah was already preparing the elderly man for transport. She fashioned a stretcher from a wooden door she had found in the mosque and secured him to it with strips torn from medical supplies. The man was unconscious now, which was probably a mercy given what the next hour was going to involve. Dr. Martinez helped her get the makeshift stretcher positioned for carrying. "Sarah, are you sure about this? If you run into hostiles out there..." Sarah tested the weight of a stretcher and adjusted the carrying straps. "If I don't try, he dies here. If I do try, at least he has a chance." As she prepared to leave the mosque, Sarah realized that she was about to undertake the most dangerous thing she had ever done in 3 years of working in war zones. But she was also about to do exactly what she had come here to do: put herself between a dying person and the forces that would otherwise claim his life. "Dr. Martinez," Sarah said as she lifted her end of the stretcher, "if something happens to me, make sure Ahmad knows he's going to be okay. Kids understand more than we think they do." Dr. Martinez nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Be careful. These people need you, but so do a lot of other people." Sarah managed a smile. "I didn't survive this long by taking unnecessary risks. I'll see you at the village clinic." As Sarah left the mosque carrying the wounded man toward an uncertain journey through hostile territory, she found herself thinking about the question Thompson had asked her earlier. Why was she really here? The answer was simpler than most people understood. She was here because this was where she belonged. Not safe in an American hospital treating people who had insurance and other options, but here in the places where her skills could mean the difference between life and death for people who had nowhere else to turn. As she began the 2-kilometer journey to the village clinic, carrying a dying man through terrain that might be crawling with hostile forces, Sarah Chun finally understood that she had found her calling in the most unlikely place imaginable. Behind her, the sounds of gunfire continued as Rodriguez and his team held their defensive positions while the remaining patients made their way through the tunnel. Ahead of her lay a journey that would test every survival skill she had learned during her time in war zones. But for the first time since the SEALs had appeared at their clinic, Sarah felt completely confident in her ability to handle whatever came next. This was what she had trained for, even if she hadn't known it at the time. The journey to the village clinic took Sarah through terrain that seemed designed to test every survival skill she had learned during her months in Afghanistan. The rocky ground made carrying the stretcher treacherous, and she had to stop frequently to check on her patient and adjust her grip on the makeshift handles. The elderly man, whose name she had learned was Hamid, drifted in and out of consciousness during the trip. When he was awake, his eyes reflected a mixture of pain and confusion, but also something that might have been gratitude. Sarah found herself talking to him in her broken Pashto, explaining where they were going and reassuring him that help was coming. Halfway to the village, Sarah had to take cover behind a cluster of large rocks when she heard vehicles approaching from the south. She radioed her position to Rodriguez and waited in the darkness, listening to the sound of trucks and motorcycles passing less than 100 meters from her hiding spot. Dr. Chun, Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, quietly. We show multiple hostile vehicles moving through your area. Can you stay hidden until they pass? Sarah checked Hamid's pulse and breathing before responding. Copy that, Shadow 7. Patient is stable, but critical. How much longer before the area is clear? Unknown, Doc. We're seeing a lot of movement out there. Additional hostile forces are definitely converging on this area. As Sarah waited in the darkness, she realized that the situation was becoming more complex than any of them had anticipated. The original hostile forces had been joined by reinforcements, which suggested this wasn't just a random encounter with local militias. Someone had called for backup, which meant their presence in the area was known to people with significant resources. After 20 minutes of waiting, the sounds of vehicles finally faded into the distance. Sarah checked Hamid again and found his condition deteriorating. His pulse was weaker, and his breathing had become more labored. She made the decision to continue toward the village despite the continued risk of encountering hostiles. The final kilometer to the village was the longest of Sarah's life. She had to move slowly to avoid making noise, but every minute of delay increased the chances that Hamid would die before she could get him to proper medical care. Her back and shoulders ached from carrying the stretcher, and she could feel blisters forming on her hand from the rough wooden handles. When the lights of the village clinic finally came into view, Sarah felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by new concerns. The clinic looked larger and better equipped than she had expected, but it also looked like it might be closed. Most of the windows were dark, and she couldn't see any signs of activity. Sarah radioed her position to Rodriguez as she approached the clinic entrance. Shadow 7. I'm at the village clinic with a critical patient. Building appears to be unoccupied. Investigating now. Copy that, Dr. Chun. Be advised, we're still seeing hostile vehicle movement in your general area. Exercise extreme caution. Sarah carefully lowered the stretcher and tried the clinic's main entrance. The door was unlocked, and when she pushed it open, lights automatically activated, revealing a medical facility that was far more sophisticated than anything she had expected to find in this remote village. The main treatment room contained equipment that would have been impressive in an American hospital. Digital X-ray machines, a surgical suite with modern anesthesia equipment, and a pharmacy stocked with medications she had only dreamed of having access to during her months working in improvised clinics. Sarah quickly wheeled a proper stretcher to the entrance and transferred Hamid from her makeshift carrier. His vital signs were weak but stable, and she immediately began preparing him for emergency surgery. The abdominal wound had been bleeding internally for hours, and she estimated he had lost nearly half his blood volume. As she worked to establish for access and begin blood replacement therapy, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from the rear of the building. She tensed, reaching for the radio to call for help, but the voice that called out was speaking English with a distinctly American accent. Hello, is someone there? I heard movement in the treatment room. An elderly man appeared in the doorway, wearing surgical scrubs and a concerned expression. He appeared to be in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'm Dr. Sarah Chun, she said quickly, not stopping her work on Hamid. This man has a severe abdominal wound and needs immediate surgery. Are you a surgeon? The man moved immediately to assist her. Dr. Robert Harrison, retired trauma surgeon from Boston. I've been volunteering here for 2 years. What's his status? Sarah briefed Dr. Harrison quickly while they worked together to stabilize Hamid. Harrison's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades saving lives in operating rooms, and Sarah felt her first real hope that Hamid might survive. We need to get him into surgery immediately, Dr. Harrison said after completing his examination. I can see at least 2 sources of internal bleeding, and there may be more. Can you assist? Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. But I need to radio my team first. There are more wounded patients coming and hostile forces in the area. As Sarah contacted Rodriguez to update him on the situation, Dr. Harrison began preparing the surgical suite. The professional efficiency with which he worked reminded Sarah of the best surgeon she had worked with during her residency. But there was something else there too, a dedication that came from choosing to work in dangerous places because that was where the help was needed most. Shadow 7, Sarah said into the radio. I'm at the village clinic with another American doctor. We're taking the critical patient into surgery now. What's your status? Rodriguez's voice came back with good news for the first time all day. Dr. Chun, all patients are through the tunnel and at the mosque. Dr. Meadows and Dr. Martinez are preparing them for transport to your location. We've also made contact with a friendly patrol in the area. Looks like our beacon signal reached the right people. Sarah felt a wave of relief. How long before backup arrives? Estimate 20 minutes for air support, 45 minutes for ground extraction. Think you can keep everyone alive until then? Sarah looked around the well-equipped clinic, then at Dr. Harrison, who was expertly preparing surgical instruments. We can definitely keep everyone alive. This clinic is equipped for anything we might need. As Sarah scrubbed in for surgery, she found herself reflecting on the events of the day. 12 hours ago, she had been working in an improvised clinic, doing her best to help people with limited resources and constant danger. Now she was about to perform emergency surgery in a facility that rivaled anything she had trained in. Dr. Chun, Dr. Harrison said as they began the operation, can I ask how you ended up carrying a critically wounded patient through hostile territory in the middle of the night? Sarah continued her work while explaining the day's events. As she talked, she could see Dr. Harrison's respect for her decisions growing. By the time she finished the story, they had successfully located and repaired the sources of Hamid's internal bleeding. That was extraordinary work today, Dr. Harrison said as they completed the surgery. Not just the medical care, but the tactical thinking. You probably saved all their lives. Sarah was cleaning up from the operation when her radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. Dr. Chun, we're moving the remaining patients to your location now. ETA, 15 minutes. How's the critical patient? Surgery successful, Sarah replied. Patient is stable and should make a full recovery. Dr. Harrison says the clinic can handle all our patients. Copy that. Be advised, air support is inbound. And we have ground units moving to establish a security perimeter around the clinic. Looks like everyone's going home safe. As Sarah prepared to receive the remaining patients, she thought about Rodriguez's words. Going home safe. But where was home for someone like her? The comfortable apartment she maintained in the United States, where she spent only a few months each year between assignments. Or was it places like this where her skills and courage could make the difference between life and death for people who had nowhere else to turn? Dr. Meadows and Dr. Martinez arrived with the remaining patients just as the first helicopter appeared on the horizon. The reunion was emotional but brief. There was still work to do. Ahmad, the little boy with a broken leg, needed x-rays to determine if he would require surgery. The head injury patient needed careful monitoring, and the other wounded villagers required continued care. Rodriguez and his team arrived as the helicopters were establishing a security perimeter around the clinic. The staff sergeant looked exhausted, but satisfied as he found Sarah in the treatment room. Dr. Chun, he said, I owe you an apology. When we first met, I thought you were a civilian who needed to be rescued. I was wrong about a lot of things today. Sarah looked up from her work, checking Ahmed's leg x-rays. You weren't wrong, Staff Sergeant. You did rescue us, just not in the way you expected. Rodriguez considered this. Can I ask you something? After everything that happened today, are you going to stay in the area? Sarah looked around the well-equipped clinic, then at Ahmad, who was finally smiling as she showed him his x-rays and explained that his leg would heal perfectly. Dr. Harrison has offered me a position here, she said. This clinic serves a dozen villages in the region, and they need more staff. It's still dangerous, Rodriguez pointed out. Today won't be the last time hostile forces threaten this area. Sarah nodded. I know, but that's exactly why the work matters. These people don't have the option of going somewhere safer. This is their home, and they deserve access to medical care regardless of the political situation. As the night wore on and the wounded patients were stabilized, Rodriguez found himself thinking about Sarah's words. He had spent his military career learning to identify threats and eliminate them. But Sarah had spent her career learning to identify suffering and heal it, often in the same dangerous places where he operated. When the extraction helicopters arrived to take Rodriguez's team back to base, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Dr. Chun, he said, if you're staying in the area, you might need some additional security consultation. I've got leave time coming up, and I know some people who specialize in protecting humanitarian operations. Sarah smiled, understanding the offer behind his words. I think that could be arranged. Dr. Harrison mentioned they've been looking for someone to help train local staff in security procedures. As Rodriguez prepared to leave with his team, he looked back at the clinic one more time. Through the windows, he could see Sarah and Dr. Harrison working on their patients, Dr. Meadows reading a story to the children who were staying overnight for observation, and Dr. Martinez organizing medical supplies for the next day's work. Thompson, whose shoulder was properly bandaged and immobilized, appeared beside Rodriguez. Sarge, you realize we're probably all going to be court-martialed for disobeying orders today? Rodriguez nodded. Probably. Was it worth it? Thompson looked through the clinic windows at Ahmad, who was teaching Dr. Martinez some words in Pashto while she checked his leg splint. Yes, Sarge. It was worth it. 6 months later, the military tribunal reviewing the events of that day would conclude that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and his team had acted with exceptional courage under extraordinary circumstances. Their decision to prioritize the protection of civilian medical personnel and wounded noncombatants, even at the cost of disobeying direct orders, was cited as an example of the highest traditions of military service. But Rodriguez would always believe that the real heroes of that day were 3 American doctors who had chosen to put themselves in harm's way to help people they didn't know in a place where their own government couldn't protect them. Sarah Chun continued working in the region for another 2 years, eventually establishing a network of clinics that served communities throughout the mountains. She never forgot the day when 6 Navy SEALs chose to disobey orders rather than abandon wounded civilians, or the lesson that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to stand between vulnerable people and the forces that would harm them. The little girl named Amara, who had wanted to be a teacher, eventually graduated from the local school and went on to study medicine. She often said that her decision to become a doctor was inspired by watching American medical volunteers risk their lives to help her community. And in a small village clinic in the mountains of Afghanistan, a plaque still hangs on the wall commemorating the day when soldiers and doctors discovered they were fighting the same war, just with different weapons.